Well, good afternoon and welcome to another Yarra Valley Writers Festival New Release Sunday, in fact our penultimate for this year. And today we meet Meg Keneally, a writer with a wonderfully diverse background, having worked in such fields as corporate finance, talkback radio production. She's worked as an editor and even a scuba diving instructor. In fact, it's that last interest, a lifelong interest in maritime history and archaeology, that's led to Meg's second novel, The Wreck, a wonderful tale of historical fiction set in early colonial Australia. It's a story of escape, survival and of course shipwrecks, with a terrific female lead. Meg's captain for the voyage this afternoon is another writer and friend of the Yarra Valley Writers Festival, Donna. Hope you enjoy the chat.
Okay, thank you, Michael, for that wonderful introduction. I would like to begin this afternoon by acknowledging the country on which I come to you from, which is the country of the Willam people of the Wurundjeri tribe of the Kulin Nation. I want to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and remind us all that this land is not yet ceded. However, I have to say I'm very proud to be a Victorian at this moment, because we are working toward a treaty in this area. We're here this afternoon to talk about The Wreck by Meg Keneally. This is her second beautiful historical novel. I already encourage you to get a copy from the shop, your favourite way of getting books, and have a look at it. Very privileged to be having this conversation with Meg. So good afternoon, Meg.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me. And I'll just say I'm coming to you from the country of the Gamagal of the Eora Nation. And like you, I acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, and privileged to live and work on the unceded land of the Gamagal. So thank you for having me, and hello everyone.
Yes, great to have you here in cyberspace.
Yes.
For the Yarra Valley Writers Festival. Meg, so excited to talk about this book. You've written two books, historical novels. The first one's called The Fled. It's called Fled. This one's called The Wreck. Sorry, just that little word just snuck in there. I wonder if you could just, for those who haven't read the book yet, give us a little outline of what The Wreck's about.
Well, The Wreck is the central character, Sarah McCaffrey, loses her parents in a peaceful protest that turns violent in 1819 and becomes radicalised, takes part in a failed uprising and finds herself, while escaping, on a ship bound for New South Wales. And when the ship is wrecked, she's the sole survivor, tries to make a new life for herself and run away from her past in New South Wales. But of course, you know, when somebody tries to run away from their past in a novel, it never works out. Their past always follows them. So essentially, yes, it's about her journey from disaffected to a rebel and a radical to a shipwrecked survivor to somebody who wants to replicate the rebellion in the new land to somebody who, through the mentorship of another woman, eventually comes to see that there's a better way.
Yes. It's different to The Fled.
Yes, different to Fled, yeah.
Yes.
Because Fled was the story, the fictionalised story of a woman who actually existed.
Mm.
And with The Wreck, I wanted to tie together four disparate historical elements, and I created Sarah as a means to tie these four events or people who actually existed, which I've fictionalised, to tie them all together.
Yeah, I was really interested in how you did that, because the structure of the book is different to Fled. With Fled, you're quite close to a historical character, whereas this you're bringing different events together to create the characters in a way.
Yes.
So my question, as I was reading it, was, as a writer, how did this get into your head to do?
Well, it started with just an idea, just a very tiny idea, and it sort of grew out from there. And the idea was, I always wanted to write about a shipwreck called the Dunbar, which was wrecked here in New South Wales a couple of decades later than my fictional wreck, but they do share a lot of characteristics. And the Dunbar remains the deadliest maritime disaster in New South Wales history. I'm a keen scuba diver, and I've dived on the site where that wreck happened, and occasionally after a storm you find tea tokens and coins and belt buckles, and it's very touching, which we'll of course immediately give to the National Maritime Museum. That wreck has always fascinated me for two reasons. First of all, I find it heartbreaking that that ship made it all the way from Plymouth to a kilometre outside of the Sydney Heads and then was wrecked. And no one knows why the captain drove the ship into a cliff to this day. It happened at the Gap, for those who know Sydney. And the second reason I find it fascinating is there was a sole survivor. And so that was what emboldened me to have Sarah as the sole survivor of the wreck, because otherwise I would have thought it would be too implausible. But this man, this survivor, was thrown up on, it was in the middle of a violent storm, and he was thrown up on a rock ledge and sort of remained there semi-conscious for 2 days before he was winched to safety.
Wow.
Yeah.
And Sarah's discovered, isn't she? Is she discovered? I just can't quite remember. I'm sorry. Yeah.
She is discovered at the unconscious, at having been thrown onto a rock ledge the way the actual survivor was. And this shipwreck is fascinating because when you read the accounts of the day, the newspaper reports and so forth, it becomes very obvious how cataclysmic this was in the Sydney of the time. Everybody knew someone who was affected. Everyone knew a family who was bereaved. And the wreck itself was such a violent event that eyewitness accounts describe dismembered limbs and heads being thrown on the waves below, and people watching from the cliff tops and retching and seeing friends or loved ones being churned around by the sea. It's just, when I first read those accounts, you sort of think shipwreck, ship runs into a cliff, gets a great big hole in its hull and sinks, but you don't imagine that level of violence. Yeah, so it was quite a cataclysmic event.
Are there any rumours about why the captain did this?
Well, we don't know for sure. It was nighttime. It was a very bad storm, and it is possible that he mistook the Gap for the entryway to Sydney Heads when he should have really stood off till morning, but he probably thought, well, we're nearly here, I'll try to get into a safe harbour. It's possible that the positioning of Macquarie Lighthouse misled him. All sorts of, after that wreck, they built another lighthouse. They thought maybe it's a good idea to build a lighthouse right on the tip of Southend. So no one knows for sure, but when you read the inquest at which this sole survivor was interviewed, he hedges a lot. At least he seems to me. And I think he probably did not want to speak ill of the dead. So he didn't shed much light on the situation. So we'll never know for sure.
Oh, how interesting. So things are jumping into my head here. I'm thinking there's quite a resonance, I guess, with that cataclysmic event and what we're going through now. Just yesterday, I was buying groceries, as you do, fruit and veg, and the woman behind the counter was talking to me about 3 of her family who have been affected by COVID. Yeah. But they are in Italy. She's Italian, and her relatives in Italy. And like tingles still going up and down my spine, because I feel like that was the closest I got so far to knowing someone who's been affected. So there is that kind of resonance. There's a couple of modern resonances in the book, even though this is a historical novel. The other one that I thought was this theme that you have of becoming radicalised. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I love I had the idea that you seem to be working on how oppression causes radicalism, or breeds to it. So I was thinking about all the conversations we've had about ISIS, people who are in ISIS becoming radicalised or becoming radicalised and becoming terrorists. But I was also thinking about Black Lives Matter all at the same time, about how oppression radicalises. So I felt there were a lot of modern resonances to Sarah's story.
Well, I'm always really interested in historical events which can tell us something about today. And that's why I opened it with the Peterloo Massacre, because suppression of peaceful protest is an issue around the world. And, you know, around the time the book came out, we saw peaceful protesters in Washington being tear gassed. So it's happening even in, you know, major democracies. And certainly the event that I write about, that I open the book with, became known as the Peterloo Massacre. And this actually happened in 1819. Around 60 to 100,000 people gathered to hear a speaker talk about British parliamentary reform, which all sounds rather dry, of course, in retrospect, but these people were very, very hungry. They were disenfranchised. But nevertheless, it was a peaceful day. People brought their families, they brought their children, they brought picnics, there were bands. It had a real carnival atmosphere. But the magistrates of the day had the French Revolution in living memory and thought that there might be a revolution. So they sent in armed hussars and yeomen who cut their way through the crowd. Children were killed. You know, it was indiscriminate. So these people had just come to listen to a talk, and for that some of them lost their lives. It was essentially Britain's Tiananmen Square. And this event has always both fascinated and appalled me. I've wanted to write about it for a long time. So because even though it was 200 years ago, there's still a lot that we can learn from it.
Oh, I agree, and I have to say, reading the book, I had so many kind of stories coming through me. Like Les Mis was there, Les Miserables, I should say, and also Poldark. I kept saying Poldark, particularly the strong woman. I forget his wife's name, the redhead, Imelda, something like that. She, when I was watching Poldark, I kept thinking, oh, she's such an emancipated woman. Could that possibly be true at that time? But as I got into Poldark, I realised that, of course, it was the most revolutionary time in England, and that it wasn't just the French Revolution, it was the Russian Revolution. The world was really changing. Ideas of equality and liberty were rampant, and the Brits were really frightened that this was going to contaminate them while they were busily sending criminals, so-called criminals, to Australia. And I thought, I often think that that's our inception. Our colonial moment was born at a time of revolutionary ideas, but also an incredible reaction to those revolutionary ideas.
Yeah, a very strong overreaction. And of course, a lot of people would have been alive and maybe served in the military at the time of the American Revolution as well.
Yes.
And, you know, Thomas Paine, The Rights of Man, was front and centre for a lot of people. And the working class were having the temerity to ask, you know, can we maybe eat, maybe have a vote, something like that? You know? And of course, the other revolution which was going on at the time was the Industrial Revolution.
Exactly.
So the world really was being picked up and shaken in a way that I think it's hard to appreciate it when you look back at these events individually, but when you look at it as a period of 30 or 40 years when there was change, it's easy to see how the world, you know, the social order was beginning to be remade. And I've always been very interested in that period for that reason.
Yes, it's an incredible time. The other book that I went to as I was reading yours, particularly Sarah and Mrs. Thistle, the characters, reminded me of Anne Summers' Damned Whores and God's Police.
Oh, that's a huge compliment.
Yes, well, it's the same time. You know, she was talking about that kind of place, but also she was talking about Caroline Chisholm, of course. But Mrs. Thistle is not Caroline Chisholm.
No, she's inspired by Mary Reeby, who is a Mary Reeby was one of the 4 elements I wanted to bring into this book. She has always fascinated me as a woman. If anyone watching has a $20 note in their pocket, they can take it out and look at a picture of her, and she looks all grandmotherly and sweet. It's the only existing picture of her. It's taken from a portrait that was painted of her when she was in later years. She looks like she wants to make you scones, but she would have been a very tough cookie because she was transported at the age of 14 for stealing a horse. She was dressed as a boy, and they didn't find out she was a girl until just before they left for New South Wales. So a girl in her mid-teens lands in Australia, and she was married by the time she was 16 or 17, bore her husband, Thomas Reeby, 8 children, and he was a moderately successful trader on the Hawkesbury River. After he died, she took over his business and grew it into this sprawling real estate and trade empire that made her one of the wealthiest people in the colony and a regular dinner guest at Government House, and someone able to buy and sell most people who would have sneered at her when she first arrived. So I've often wondered what it must have taken as both a woman and a convict to build that business. I mean, it would have been hard enough for anyone, but for somebody with those two, what were at the time disadvantages, she must have been an extraordinarily tough woman, an extraordinarily canny one. And I've always wanted to write about her. So Mrs. Thistle is based on her. It's not, she's not a fictionalized version of Mary Reeby, but she's inspired by Mary Reeby. Because another thing I really like writing about is female leadership.
Yeah.
That was a sort of central theme of both Fled and the Wreck, particularly at a time where female leadership was seen as an oxymoron, where it wasn't welcomed, and where women had to find ways to exert leadership despite, you know, the deck being stacked against them, and had to pull the levers they had, and had to be a little bit cunning in the way they exerted their power when they were lucky enough to have it. So Mrs. Thistle, to me, is obviously an exemplar of female leadership in colonial Australia, as is, you know, Elizabeth MacArthur, for example. But I was very, very keen to write about her for that reason.
Yes, and I did get the sense that Mary Wollstonecraft would have been strong in her thoughts as well.
Yes.
There's that proto-feminism that's going on at that time.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Women's suffrage was just beginning, really.
Yeah. And
yeah.
I mean, it was the colony at the time was not like the society in England. And so you had women who were running businesses. There's a terrific book called Minding Her Own Business by, I think it's Catherine Bishop, I apologise if I've gotten the name wrong, that I used as one of the sources for this book. And it talks of the colonial businesswomen who essentially made Sydney, the bakers, the boarding house owners. There were a lot of school mistresses, and women were a real force in business and enterprise in colonial Sydney in a way that perhaps they couldn't have been in England. But certainly Mary Reeby was the pinnacle of business savvy in colonial Sydney.
Yeah, it's I mean, such an important work that you're doing really with this book, because it could be easily seen to be a rewrite of history that may not have been relevant to the time, may not have been within its context. But the more you think about it, the more you can see how history has been written for a masculine, for a men's.
Oh, yeah.
And that women have been written out. So it's just wonderful to see this. One of the elements of the relationship between Mrs. Thistle and Sarah. Sarah arrives and she's the radical that's been radicalised through oppression and through a terrible massacre. And we didn't talk about the Cato conspiracy, which also inspired Sarah. Do you want to say something about that, just to bring all the elements together?
Yeah, because that was the last element that I wanted Sarah to tie together. And as I said, I wanted her arc to be from disaffection to radicalisation, and then slowly coming back towards a different worldview. So the Cato's, she is involved in an uprising which is loosely modelled on an event which occurred in 1820 called the Cato Street Conspiracy, in which a group of Spencean philanthropists, they were followers of the radical writer Thomas Spence, who was in the same vein as Thomas Paine, hatched a plan to overthrow the government. They were told through a spy that there was going to be a cabinet dinner at the house of one of the cabinet ministers, and they were going to storm it, behead the cabinet, and form a provisional government. Unfortunately for them, that information, which had been fed to them through one of their number, was the guy who'd fed it to them and who was part of their group was actually a police spy. Yeah. So they were all arrested before they could carry out their plan. But I sort of bracket that. I've often thought of that event and the Peterloo Massacre in the same context. First of all, the leader of the group was at the Peterloo Massacre. And it happened, less than a year after the Peterloo Massacre. Yes. And there is certainly, I think, something of a causal link between the two, because I was really interested in looking at what happens when you push someone so far that they feel they don't have anything to lose. You've already taken from them everything that matters. Yeah. What do they do then? Yeah. And sometimes what they do is turn to essentially terrorism. And Sarah, in her involvement in this plot, is essentially a terrorist or would be terrorist, which is something I obviously don't condone, but I was very, very interested in looking at the link between oppression and radicalisation. And the people involved in the Cato Street conspiracy also felt that they had no other choice, which doesn't justify chopping people's heads off, but there was just no recourse. There was nothing they could do.
It's the frustration and the rage, isn't it?
Yeah.
Through that we also see today, the frustration and the rage. And I think, that's been outlined in some of the work that talks about the development of ISIS, that there's poverty, there's alienation involved first, and then there's radicalisation comes as their only attempt to make meaning of life and to create a life that's, just basic, as you said before, food on the table, roof over your head, a job that has meaning, that pays you enough to get those things. These are all things that we're talking about today. It's so remarkable.
And I mean, people who are having their needs met, who feel they're being treated fairly, who feel that they have a voice, are not likely to be, take up arms and become radicals. So it often amazes me that we look at the result in isolation without looking at the cause.
That's right.
So
I guess, to me it resonates very strongly with the current debate we're having in Australia about New Start. Just really at that basic level. And on one side of the fence, we've got people who say, well, if people get money for nothing, they'll never do anything. right? Which is an attitude that was certainly happening in the UK at the time.
Oh, very much so, very much so.
Yeah,
and in Australia as well, you know, I'm amazed by when I read colonial writers, people who wrote in the colonial period, they sound like they could be on a commercial talkback station today. They really do. There was this one pastoralist called James Moody who returned to England very huffily, complaining about the leniency that was shown to the convicts, and he wrote a book called The Felonry of New South Wales and was the first person to coin the term felonry. But in this book, he said, it's outrageous. People are actually committing crimes to get sent to New South Wales so they can have a cushy life out.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, and it reminded me of someone saying, you know, I've heard people on talkback radio in the past say women are having babies so they can get the single.
Oh, yeah.
It's the same sort of ridiculousness.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Despite the fact that we're talking about, so on the other side we talk about this gap between the wealthy and the poor, and the bigger that gap is, the more fractious and chaotic a society. And we're just watching this gap grow and grow and grow in Australia. So you know, your book's hitting the mark in so many ways. And sort of, you know, and in another way, I think it's really sad that it is, because one would hope that we'd, come further. But I guess we may have come further in a way. We have, of course, in a great many ways. I think one of the things I was constantly thinking when I was writing about this, though, is that we do pat ourselves on the back a little too much, being evolved, you know, for treatment of women, for treatment of Indigenous peoples, for treatment of people who just want to have a say. So certainly I would rather be living in 2020 than 1820. I mean, my family were at that time were living in Ireland. It would be 15 years before my great-great-grandparents would be transported in 1820, but they were extremely poor as well. I would certainly rather be in 2020 than 1820 with, you know, antibiotics and dentistry and all of those wonderful things. But I don't think we can, you know, dust off our hands and say job done, because it's not. And the demonisation of, I wanted to put in particularly a few scenes where Molly Thistle is demonised for being a woman who has the audacity to be successful, because I think the demonisation of female leaders in very gendered ways is something we still have not moved beyond. And also the female leaders who formed the female reform societies in the lead up to Peterloo. I wanted to also put in a scene where one of them is pilloried in the most awful gendered way by the media, because that happened. Yes.
And the role of the female reform societies in Manchester has been pretty much not written out of history, but a lot of the books I read on Peterloo gave it only a glancing mention. The only book that gave it more than that was written by a woman. So I wanted to talk about them as well, these women who stood up and said, actually, we have a right to have our voices heard as well.
Yes. Yeah.
And
it seems to me like particularly with Julia Gillard becoming Prime Minister, that's when it really kind of came out. I mean, certainly, well, Anne Summers was talking about it, and Germaine Greer were talking about it, but Anne particularly because she located her discussion in the colonies. But when Julia Gillard became Prime Minister, it was as if it was this huge surprise. That we Australians did this to me. And, you know, we're having another surprise. It's a huge surprise today to find out that our SAS soldiers in Afghanistan are committing war crimes. We have this idea of what it is to be Australian, and then there's a reality to it. Yeah.
So, I don't think I think we've come a long way. I don't think we've come as far as we would like, perhaps, to think.
I think we are. Yes,
Yeah.
we have.
Mm.
Yes, yes. I was interested also again with you have this arc of Sarah becoming radicalised, then she encounters Mrs. Thistle. There's this wonderful moment in the book where Mrs. Thistle says to Sarah, "If you've got something to tell me now."
Mm.
And Sarah doesn't. And then eventually when she does, Mrs. Thistle is outraged by that. She can't forgive Sarah. I was just fascinated by that idea of forgiveness, particularly in that relationship between the mentor and the mentee, which is, yes. Can you say something about that?
Well, I mean, the way I wrote Mrs. Thistle was she's the kind of woman, and we've all known women like this, who actually feels very deeply but hides it behind efficiency and briskness and getting things done and constantly in motion, and, you know, slapping people metaphorically about the chops and so forth. But down deep, she cares very deeply, and she is frustrated that she cannot find someone who is really on her wavelength in terms of running the business. She's getting older. She's looking for a lieutenant. She would rather that lieutenant be a woman, but she, you know, and then she and Sarah form a sort of, as you say, a mentor-mentee relationship, and she comes to view Sarah as like almost like another daughter, but makes it clear to her from the outset that she sets great store by honesty, which you would have had to in those days. What else did you have? You know, you had to be able to, you couldn't Google someone. You had to be able to trust. Sarah, her failure to tell Mrs. Thistle the truth, because she takes an assumed name. She's still being looked for in England in connection with this uprising. She knows that they know that she's left England. She doesn't know if they know where she's gone, but she's constantly looking over her shoulder. She doesn't know if she tells Mrs. Thistle the truth, whether Mrs. Thistle will have her arrested. By the way, I did, the audio book was read wonderfully by a wonderful actress called Lucy Dixon, and I wrote her a note saying, I do apologise for naming a character Mrs. Thistle, because she had
there was no lisp involved.
You know, Sarah doesn't know whether she can trust Molly Thistle, and when she eventually is forced by circumstances to come clean, Molly says, I can't forgive you this. If you had told me 6 months ago, I could have forgiven you. But then Sarah makes the point, and this is very true too, when people say, you haven't been honest with me, I could have forgiven you if you'd just been honest. Sarah says, if I'd been honest with you from the outset, you never would have let me run your boarding house. You never would have taken me into your business. We never would have gotten to this point. So
it was that really got me thinking about forgiveness as an act. Yes, and how important it is and how challenging it can be.
Absolutely, because we tend to go into our bunkers and into the default position of balancing the ledger. Well, they did this to me, and so I feel that I need to do that to even it all up. And Mrs. Thistle, being a businesswoman, has that kind of mentality as well. But of course, true forgiveness is chucking the ledger in the bin.
And it's that to me, it's sort of the fault line of that time in a way, because at that time people weren't forgiven for being poor, you know, and they weren't forgiven for being a woman, or they weren't forgiven for, I don't know, promoting revolutionary attitudes. They were unforgiven very severely. And the world was a kind of black and white kind of way. But then it was very religious at the same time. And religion is the story of forgiveness, really.
Yes.
And I was kind of interested about the colony, because you do write a lot about the colony, and that interplay between religion and secularism, I guess we'll call it. They didn't have that word then, but yeah. How did you find that when you were looking at the colony?
Well, it was just so pervasive that it was part of the fabric of everyday life, and whether you were a believer or not, you went to church. Another book I co-wrote with my dad, actually, there was, and I sort of referenced this in the rec as well. The church was not only a religious institution, but also a very social one.
Yeah.
And it was a yardstick, one of the yardsticks by which people measured their influence. So if you had a box pew, for example, up the front near the governor's, then you were in. And one of the characters in the rec, like swanning home from church, saying, "Oh yes, I was speaking to the governor after the service," and so on and so forth. So it was just, you know, an expected adherence to whatever faith you're part of. Sarah turns away from her Catholic faith after her parents are killed. And finds herself in a world where the God that she promised was always there, she doesn't now believe is.
Yeah.
And that's not a major, I haven't really written a lot about that, but that's a sort of undercurrent that's running along beside her as well. And certainly there was an expectation of how of moral behaviour, and so on and so forth. But I have Molly Thistle make the point that, and as you say, people were not forgiven for being convicts, they weren't forgiven for being women, and so on and so forth. But I do have Molly Thistle make the point that at one point she says, they forget that you are a convict when you can afford to buy their homes.
Yes, that's right. Yes. So forgiveness comes in. It's sort of the beginning of capitalism in a way, and that amoral quality of capitalism, that you can be forgiven anything if you if you're rich enough. Yes.
Yeah.
And you can even be forgiven your gender.
Yes.
As long as you're rich. So we've got that idea about, you know, if you're poor, then you're to blame for it. That is actually a thread in particularly the charismatic Christian.
Yeah, the idea that, you know, if you're not prosperous,
God's not looking favourably on you.
Yeah, which of course is the biggest load of.
Yes.
I won't use the word I want to use.
Exactly. We know what you're saying. Yes. It's kind of interesting. It's very interesting how these dichotomies play out in the colony much clearer. It's more complex today, it seems to me, because we've got a desire to be secular, that's, you know, to be not religious, and yet we are quite a religious country.
But there's still also this impulse to victim blame. That ran through society then, and it still runs through it today, you know, going back to those talkback callers saying, oh, you know,
yes,
people won't get off their backsides and give it a go. I know many, many people who have been unable to find work, who have gotten off their backsides every single day and really worn out significant amounts of shoe leather looking for work and doing volunteer work in the interim. So anybody who actually opens their eyes knows that poverty is not the fault of those who are struggling with it.
Yes.
But then, as now, there is a certain mentality that suggests that it's your fault if you're not doing well.
Yes. Do you think the pandemic will affect that attitude?
It's hard to say, isn't it, how things are going to shake out. I mean, I'm just so proud of Australians for pulling together on it. I think it's wonderful when you look at what's happening in other countries, particularly the United States, and so grateful to everyone in Victoria for undergoing what you've undergone, taking one for the team.
Proud to do it for the country. I have to say, I'm so impressed to be a Victorian, even though that was a great struggle. For many, it was much worse than it was for me, but it was a struggle for me as well. I feel so achieved. on behalf of the nation, and I feel that many Victorians feel achieved as well. And
yeah, you have a right to. You have a right to. I mean, it's the fact is that yes, they were requirements, but requirements wouldn't have mattered if everybody hadn't said, okay, we're going to do this. It's not going to be easy, but we're going to do it. And I'm just full of admiration for Victorians. Sitting in Sydney, we're so grateful to Victoria for going through this willing deprivation of all activities outside the home.
It was very good to hear people say that. And look, this kind of echoes the book, funnily enough. The hardest bit for me, I don't know if it was hard for everyone, but the hardest bit for me was turning the news on at night and seeing our Leader of the Opposition, backed up by the Prime Minister, the Treasurer and the Minister for Health, accusing Daniel Andrews of not doing it right relentlessly and irrationally. And it seemed to me that it was an expression of that part of being Australian, for blaming people for anything. Just have a go at being horrible. And I was reading your book during this time, so it was very resonant on so many levels. So thank you for writing it, and thank you for the timing, however that happened. I mean, I do believe that every book comes into the world at the perfect time, regardless of how editors and publishers plan. It will come in when it's perfect.
Yes, I hope so. I have to admit, releasing it in the same month as Trent Dalton, Craig Silvey, Richard Flanagan was a bit. I'm like, hello.
Yes, and all men too, I might just add. And here you come in with the story of two strong women, really, because Sarah becomes stronger than I think she ever imagined she was going to be.
Yeah. Ultimately she does.
I wonder if we can spend a few moments talking about your writing life, because as a writer I'm interested as well. I
always love hearing writers talk about their process, and their, it's endlessly fascinating to me.
So I'm intrigued in so many ways, because as a writer I didn't have a famous writer dad, and so I can't imagine what that might have been like growing up with that, and then finding out that you were a writer. How did that happen?
Well, when you're a kid, of course, your life is your life, and you don't really question it. So, but I mean, I had a very happy upbringing, lots of stories, lots of, lots surrounded by books, read to constantly. In fact, here's something cute. When my first book came out, my parents got me a print, and I'll just show you. That is a print from Dr. Seuss's The Sneetches.
Oh, yes.
So when my first book came out, my parents got that for me because it was the first book I could read by myself. So from the first book I could read by myself to the first book I wrote by myself.
Yes. That's beautiful. That's a lovely arc, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, he was always very encouraging. I actually tried 3 times to get published. So I wrote 3 novels which will never see the light of day and couldn't get them published. And I set it aside for a while.
But when was the moment when you thought you were a writer? I mean,
well, sometimes I still don't. It's you're always waiting for somebody to leap out from behind the aspidistra and say you're a fraud.
That's exactly true. And I didn't know you also have that aspidistra.
Oh, that aspidistra is everywhere. It's like a chicken. Dad, I put writing aside for a while, although I still did it for just therapeutic reasons, just because I've always loved doing it. I don't even know where all my notebooks are, but I've probably got a small room full of notebooks that I've scribbled into over the years. And then Dad approached me and said, look, I want to write this murder mystery series based on a gentleman convict detective. and I would like to work on it with you. And after a little while, it became apparent that us writing alternate chapters as we'd intended to wasn't going to work out because our voices are very different. So I wrote the first draft, and then we worked on it together. And there are 4 novels in that series now. It's called the Montserrat series. And in each of them, we'd plot it together. I'd go away and write it, and then we would edit it together. And that process was extraordinary for me. It was like a personal masterclass, because I got such an insight into the way he works, into the way his mind works, into his ability to add layers of nuance and meaning with just by adding a paragraph here or there. So it was fascinating to sort of look behind the curtain and see the technical side of how it works, see how the gears mesh, So that was, I'm always grateful for that experience, because I kind of thought, well, I've tried 3 times and I haven't been published, so maybe I just don't have it. And without him sort of drawing me back into it, I think I always would have still written, and I think eventually I would have tried again. But it was wonderful to have. I was so fortunate to have that opportunity. And I think for me, it's always been, published or unpublished, it's always been a compulsion, because if you write a novel and you spend a year of your life on it, among, raising kids and doing paid work and other things, you spend so much time on it and it gets rejected. If you then back up and do it again and it gets rejected, and then you do it again and it gets rejected, I think you're meant to do this.
It feels like a message.
So, I mean, if you can keep throwing yourself on the barricades, I firmly believe with persistence, most people can be successful at this, but it does take a lot of persistence. But if you do keep on with it, you will get there. And I used to view those manuscripts as a waste of time, and now I view them as training. And I'm glad now that they didn't get published, because if they were good enough to get published, they would have been. At the time, it hurt like hell, but I'm glad now of it, because it also gives me the confidence that I wasn't published based on my surname. Which is a good confidence to have as well. And also it allows me to put something out in the world that I'm proud of. And I don't know whether I would have necessarily, after a time, been proud of putting out those novels that didn't get published. So it all comes full circle in the end. But if anyone out there has had a few rejections, if you just keep at it. And I know the only writer I know who has had their first novel accepted is Dad.
Oh.
every other writer sympathised with me when I got knockbacks, and I'm like, what do you know?
You've never been rejected. I think, I always think of Elizabeth Jolly, who's the most rejected writer in the world, I think. Yes, she, so I hail from Western Australia and had, bits to do with Elizabeth, but she used to turn up to every writers' festival and say, well, I could wallpaper my house with rejections, and she didn't get her first acceptance until she turned 50. Not because she turned 50, that's just how old she was. That was incredibly inspiring to me, although I tend to have always just written for myself, and then, suddenly thought that perhaps someone else might like to read what I have to say. But it was a different kind of coming into writing. I never decided to be a writer. I sort of fell into
you just are.
Because you've got something to say, and then it starts to become a book somehow. I do wonder about your writing process every day. How do you oh no, there was another question I wanted to ask you. Just what were the kind of things that you found in those manuscripts that didn't get published that teach you now? What are the sorts of things that
I think the most important thing, because the actual sentences, the words were fine. my characters didn't have enough agency. And I think that's the most important thing. And whenever someone's done me the honour of showing me a manuscript that they've been unable to get published, 9 times out of 10, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with it, except for the fact that the central character is standing inside this swirl of events which are acting on them, but they're not acting on events.
Yes.
And it's really, really important to, and, you know, I even struggled with that in this novel, and my wonderful editor, Kate Goldsworthy, took me by the hand and helped me find a way to giving Sarah more agency.
Right.
But characters they can't just drift through events. They have to do something to move their own story forward. And every character, major or minor, needs a reason to be on the page. They need to be there to show you more about the central character, or to move the plot forward, or for whatever reason. But you need to be able to think, this character is here to do this narrative job.
Yes.
So I think the biggest issue with my characters in those early attempts was that they didn't have sufficient agency. And my mum is a terrific reader. She reads all Dad's stuff. She very kindly reads all my stuff. And I always know when I'm in trouble if she tells me she wants to slap a character.
Oh, okay. That's a visceral response, isn't it?
Yes. Well,
and so is that kind of your flaw? If you like, I feel like I have flaws because I can sort of overwrite and I'm constantly trying to pull back. But you feel that your flaws about giving a person, like fleshing them out and giving them a sense of energy and
just making sure that they are acting on events and that they are moving the plot forward. That old adage of before you go out, look in the mirror and remove one accessory, or
yes,
whatever people say. Yes. It's the same in reverse with novels. If you think you have given your central character enough obstacles to overcome, add one more. Turn up the heat. Because all novels are essentially about conflict. So the more you can torture your characters, the better.
And on that note, I'm so glad I write non-fiction because life seems to present more hurdles than you ever could imagine.
Yeah.
So our process. Yes, your daily. How is it? Yeah.
It depends because I've got a day job as well, so it depends on what I need to do for that. And like many people, life throws all sorts of, interesting things into your path. So I can't unfortunately have a set time each day where I'm like, okay, between X and Y is my writing time. But I firmly believe that if you want to get a novel written, you have to treat it like a job. So I have, instead of a set time, I have weekly word count goals. And that varies depending on the stage of the process that I'm at. When I get the first 20,000 words are a bit slower, I'm probably doing about 1,000 words a day at that point. But then when I get past that and things really start to take off and I start getting into the characters, I try to do 20,000 words a week in a first draft. And they're not necessarily good words, but you can't edit a blank page. So, and it's interesting what you were saying about just writing for yourself. I have to tell myself that's what I'm doing in the first draft. Otherwise I overthink it. And if I edited as I went, I would get paralyzed. And I think a lot of people have that issue with that. They just can't seem to move forward because they're worried that this isn't good enough or that isn't good enough. But thankfully, nobody has to ever see a first draft. And the important thing I always suggest at that stage is to get it on the page. Yes. And then you can polish it and rip it apart and stitch it back together and put in new characters and take out old ones. But for me, momentum is really important. And I have to get the words on the page first, to the point where if I think of a new character I want to add halfway through the novel, I just keep writing as though they were there all along. And it won't be until the second draft that I go in and add them in the earlier stages.
So that's how you discover it, because I always feel like I've got this piece of string that I'm, you know, holding on to that's going somewhere, but I'm in a dark alley with a blindfold on.
Yeah.
And then when I get to the end, I thought, oh, I think that's what I'm writing. So that's how it is for you. You go, oh, I didn't know that character was there. Yeah.
Definitely. It's a process of excavation.
Yes.
For sure.
Yes.
And it does mean that a lot of words end up on the cutting room floor, but that's okay, because it's all part of the process. Even if you've got chapters and chapters that don't get published, it helped you find your way into the story, and it's there still humming underneath the stuff that did get published. So, you know, as I said, I used to see rejected novels as wasted effort. I think it's really important that people don't do that, because you do get demoralized, and they're training, just like you have to train for any other job.
And often I've found that things that I wrote maybe 20 years ago, suddenly a paragraph here or there in a you know, on a bit of paper in the bottom of in a box in the bottom of the cupboard, that paragraph comes out, and it's, you know, it needs to be in whatever it is that I'm writing today. I always find that quite remarkable. I think, oh God, I wrote that, you know.
Yeah. It's funny, isn't it?
Now, you know. Yeah, it's quite incredible kind of way of doing it. And also, I did wonder, what triggers your writing? Like for me, a sentence comes into my head. Like I have an idea that I want to explore, but I can't seem to start it until I've got this opening sentence, which often doesn't stay in the text, but it's an opening sentence. What's that moment for you?
It's funny, it's not a sentence, although I agree with you, the hardest thing to write is the first sentence of the first chapter, and then you're on your way.
Yeah.
But getting that, and when I was a journalist, I always found when I was filing a story, I would spend spend a lot more time than I would have liked agonizing over the first paragraph, and then you're off to the races. But for me, because I write historical fiction, I come across aspects of history that just stop me in my tracks, and I think, I can't believe that this happened. This is incredible. I have to write about this. And I know as soon as I read something or read about an event or a person, I'm just like, oh, I have to write about this. And if I find myself itching to bore my friends and relatives with this, then I know that I have to write it. Like, my friends sort of stopped taking my calls for a while because they didn't want to hear about Mary Bryant before I wrote Fled. So I had to exercise that ghost by writing the novel. And now they're hearing about another woman from history who I'm writing about. So it's like, oh God, she's writing another book.
Yes. But look, good friends stick by you.
They do. I'm very lucky.
Yeah, mine get read to on the couch quite often, and even then I feel embarrassed that I've done that afterwards, but it's part of the creative process, isn't it? Yeah. And friends are your friends because you are this creative person, so you know they have to wear that. Meg, our time has come. And it has been such a delight to spend this hour with you.
It's been wonderful to speak to you as well, Donna. Thank you so much. Can I just very quickly as well?
Yes. Talk about your new book. Yes.
Well, it's not mine per se. This is called Animals Make Us Human. It came out at the same time as The Wreck.
I've got this one.
Thank you for that bit of product placement. I co-edited this with Leah Kaminsky, a Melbourne writer and GP who wrote The Hollow Bones most recently. It was her idea, and it's basically a book of animal writing by writers from Tony Birch to Geraldine Brooks to Pavel Parrott and so on and so forth. It's to raise money for, no one including us was paid for their involvement, because it's to raise money for the Australian Marine Conservation Society and the Australian Wildlife Conservancy as a response to the 2019-20 bushfires. So that's in shops as well at the moment for a good cause.
And do you want to just talk about what Angela Savage has done
Angela
to
Savage, she's
put a glow around this book. Yes.
Angela makes crochets literary critters for her friends and for readers. She crocheted this for me, and she contacted us when she saw the book, because what the book is essentially we asked people to write love letters to an animal or an ecosystem, because we wanted to draw on emotion, because the arguments for the intellectual arguments for conservation, people who are going to accept those have done so.
Yes.
But the way to engage people in this issue is to let them see these animals through the eyes of people who are already in love. And Angela liked that idea, and she contacted us and said, how would you feel if I organised a group of people to crochet all of the animals in the book? And she did. She mobilised a group of crafters, and they all sent the animals to Penguin Random House, where they had a class photo, and now they're on their way to the writers of the pieces, who'll also do social media with them. And it's just a little piece of pure goodness that I just adore. It's wonderful. And if anybody wants to ask questions about anything we've discussed today, you can find me on Twitter, but also or on Facebook or on Instagram. But also, if you want to see the literary critters, there's a photo on my Twitter, yes, of their class photo, if you want to see them all in there. Great. Glory.
Well, fantastic, and thank you so much for your time. And I'd like to thank in particular all the audience. It feels very weird to not have you in this room with me to say this has been wonderful and you're a wonderful audience too. And thank you to the Yarra Valley Writers Festival for having this event. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Donna, and thank you to the Writers Festival, and thank you to everyone for being here today, and stay safe and well.
Yes, stay safe and well. Yeah.
Terrific conversation. That's what I love about historical fiction, learning how much things have changed and yet how many things seem to stay the same. I do hope you can join us for next week, our final Yarra Valley Writers Festival New Release Sunday, when another two terrific women have a chat. You'll know both of them, I'm sure, two wonderful broadcasters, Fiona Gruber in conversation with Ramona Koval. Yes, the legendary literary broadcaster of ABC Radio, likewise Fiona Gruber, talking about Ramona's book, A Letter to Layla, a fascinating glimpse into our future. Hope you can join us for our last one next week. Have a lovely week.